non zesfenu meden olo sulupu prosoli honesti posen totelos ochronos.
So today we're going to talk about the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus. And again, we're focusing in the range between about 600 and 400 BC. We're going to start discussing some general context about epistemology, which is a word rooted in the Greek word for knowledge, episteme, so how we know, and early medicine, which might shed a bit of light on the context for Heraclitus. We'll talk about the city in Anatolia, Ephesus, where he was born and worked, and we'll talk a bit about his ideas and biography. Some of the themes we'll cover include relativism, or the idea that how we know depends on our particular perspective in an important way, and skepticism, the closely connected interrogation of knowledge or wondering whether we can really know anything at all. We'll also look at Heraclitus' theory that the only constant is change, at least as he was sometimes understood by some of his successors, and the pattern that he found to be constant in the change, the logos. As a general kind of slogan for three closely connected philosophers we'll be talking about in these next few videos, we could say that Heraclitus of Ephesus thinks everything changes, Parmenides of Elea thinks nothing changes, and Empedocles of Acragas thinks some things change and some things stay the same. That's a little bit of an oversimplification or a slogan for each one of them, but it's a place to start, as we'll see. So let's think about Heraclitus to begin with in the context of a wider background of the theory of knowledge and the development of early medicine in Greece. We could think here a little bit about what we don't know in terms of a famous fragment of the earlier pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes. The veil of opinion, dokos, or seeming or appearance, hangs on everything or everyone. This passage in context contrasts divine wisdom or knowledge of reality with human opinion or appearances. There's a lot of literary examples that give some background to this. We've talked in earlier videos about Homer and Hesiod and the worldview in which the gods can take away the mist or aklus that hides the reality of divine action and knowledge from the mere appearances of human experience. There's also nice examples in Homer's Iliad in the 1st and 19th books, where Achilles, the hero, is arguing with Agamemnon, the king, and Achilles comments that Agamemnon seems to lack the ability to use knowledge from the present to make inferences about the future, to see the kind of patterns that link past, present, and future. And as we'll see, this becomes important in the development of medical thought and epistemology in Greek ideas as well. Another way of looking at how philosophers in Heraclitus' time start to wonder about what we know is the sheer diversity of views or appearances that they're presented with. So there's many different traditions in Greek myth already. Homer and Hesiod and many different poets who already relate different traditions about the gods and heroes. Then there's already many philosophers who are taking different views. Think of Thales' view that everything perhaps is rooted somehow in water, Anaximander's theory of the apeiron or the unlimited, Xenophanes' ideas and his own kind of questioning attitude to mythic tradition, and Pythagoras. All these philosophers have taken different views after thinking quite carefully about many of the issues. There's also many cultural contexts, especially in Ionia in Anatolia, different myths and philosophies meeting from Egypt, from the Babylonian world, from Phoenician cultural contexts, and in Greek. So with many different traditions and ideas, even as simple as, let's say, in Egypt, the theory that the earth is a man and the sky is a woman, at least metaphorically, and in Greek, that the earth is a woman and the sky is a man, even something that might not seem very conceptually significant can raise questions. If different cultures have such different mythic ideas and traditions, then should we simply trust the one that we happen to grow up in uncritically? So you can see how that also might contribute to the comparison of opinions and views in this time. So a question this would raise is, what does this evidence for many different seemingly contradictory authorities imply for our prospects as human beings to really understand the world? One implication could be that if there's a lot of disagreement, even among people who think carefully about the issues, we must not really understand ourselves or the world yet. Thinking back to the Delphic conjunction, know thyself, we still have work to do. Another perspective could be that it's okay for there to be a lot of different apparent views or doxai. Again, coming back to Xenophanes, the veil of opinion or dokos hangs on everything. But perhaps a single truth is metaphorically expressed by all these different views. So perhaps, for example, thinking of the case of Egypt and Greece on earth and sky again, even though they represent earth and sky in different ways in their own local metaphors, both have the theory that in myth at some point, another divine entity had to intervene to separate earth and sky in order for our world to develop as it is. And perhaps that suggests that the differences are more on the surface and there's a deeper truth beneath them. And perhaps that applies to philosophy as well. In the image you can see the goddess Athena, and if we think back to the Iliad again and her relationship with the hero Diomedes, for whom she withdraws the mist that keeps human opinion apart from divine reality, that's what these philosophers are trying to do. And one way they can do it is by comparing these different traditions. Another aspect of early Greek thought that is parallel to these philosophical developments is medicine. Early doctors were trying to document symptoms and cases, make diagnoses by, in a way, engaging this veil of opinion, many different opinions about the course or the symptoms or the causation of a disease. They would try to work from appearances or doxai toward understanding etiology or real causes. And this also seems to have been influential in early philosophy. And even though he's working a little bit later, it's helpful to think about the tradition that surrounds Hippocrates of Kos, the founder of the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, at least in the Greek tradition. Hippocratic doctors would learn to diagnose a disease from the appearances or the signs, the semeia or the symptoma, the source of the English word symptom. And from what could appear, what they could see, try to understand the invisible cause or the aition that couldn't be seen. Based on that documentation of symptoms and diagnosis of a cause, they would try to produce a prognosis, a prediction for what was going to happen in the future, in a way, again, linking past, patient history, present, visible symptoms, and future, prognosis of what would happen, and then prescribe a course of treatment if possible. And again, this would require some underlying or at least assumed epistemological work. The physician would have to recognize that they cannot see the disease's cause with the eyes or hear it with the ears, but from their basic sensory perceptions of the symptoms, they can grasp through reasoning or logismos what it might be, with the eye of the mind. So in this sense, this Hippocratic prognosis, the effort to use signs and symptoms to recognize a logos, an implicit pattern, to see the invisible, can help us as well to understand something of the philosophical work that's going on. Again, remembering this literary background in the Greek poetic thought world, where the capacity to grasp, to have noesis, from this word nous, sort of direct apprehension of what's in front and behind, connecting past, present, and future, where that's a goal, whether it's a hero or a doctor or a philosopher. And if you're interested in reading a bit more about Hippocratic epistemology or theory of knowledge in medicine, there's a great article in the Cambridge Companion to Hippocrates that you could follow up. One more note about the Hippocratics. This is a famous passage from the aphorisms attributed to Hippocrates. Life is short, but the art is long. The crucial or critical moment, kairos, is sharp or fleeting. Experience is dangerous. Judgment is difficult. There's an attitude here that there's a real challenge about the practice of medicine to get it right. And as we'll see, philosophers like Heraclitus can approach philosophy in the same spirit, therapeutically. So let's come now to Ephesus and to Heraclitus, again on the coast of Anatolia. In our map of Greece that we've been exploring and the wider world around Greece, we're still on the coast of what the Greeks sometimes called Asia Minor or Anatolia, modern Turkey. Ephesus, as you can see, is really clustered with the source of a lot of the philosophical traditions we've been looking at. Colophon with Xenophanes, Miletus with Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, and Samos with Pythagoras. They're all quite close together. That also contributes to this sense of an exploration of a diversity of many views. Ephesus was the seat of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis. Here a 3D reconstruction. And Artemis, in the Ephesian sense, was connected with a number of Middle Eastern goddesses who the Greeks, through a process that was sometimes called hermeneusis, interpretatio in Latin, sought to connect or understand in terms of their own pantheon. Later on, there were a number of amazing other building projects in Ephesus. It was a wealthy and important city later in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, like the Library of Celsus, you can see here, which was actually the model used for the Great Library of Alexandria in a recent video game, Assassin's Creed Origins, which you can see here. It was also perhaps one of the biggest theater establishments in the ancient Greek-speaking world. The theater at Ephesus, constructed several hundred years after we're talking about, so around 200, might have had a capacity approaching 25,000. So this was also a center of Ionian culture, like Samos and Miletus that we've talked about in earlier videos. There is a mythic memory of its foundation by a prince of Athens, which might suggest a connection with Athens going far back into the Bronze Age, following a recommendation by the oracle at Delphi. A fish and a boar will show you the way. There was a close relationship with Artemis, as we mentioned a moment ago, identified with the Anatolian goddess Cybele, the mother of the mountains, connected to with the Greek Rhea, with associations on the island of Crete especially. As we mentioned, Ephesus was famous for major building projects like the Temple of Artemis, some of which still remains. And during Heraclitus' lifetime, when we're talking about around the 6th and 5th centuries BC, it was part of the Persian Empire. So this is the context where Heraclitus was born and worked. His name means, much like Heracles, the glory of Hera, the goddess. So he was born, we think, about 535, and according to Diogenes Laertius, who was a later collector of biographies of philosophers, he flourished, that is, was mainly active around the 69th Olympiad, which began in our reckoning in 504. So that helps us to get a sense of, at least relatively, where he is in time, relative to some of the other philosophers we've talked about. According to the biographers, he abdicated the kingship of Ephesus to his brother, and then dispensed with political life. He liked instead to play games with children in the Temple of Artemis, and he explained that playing games was preferable to politics. This might connect with some of his famous fragments or aphorisms, one that time or eternity Ion is a child at play. The kingdom belongs to a child. That's a bit of a mystery what's meant here, but it seems like there's a connection with whatever message he hoped to send, if the biographical tradition is true, by playing in the temple. He studied maybe with Xenophanes of Colophon, we're told, but said that learning a lot, polymathia, doesn't teach understanding, or else it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, or in turn Xenophanes and Hecataeus. He used to say in another fragment that Homer should be thrown out of the public contest and beaten with a stick, and the poet Archilochus too. So he had, let's say, he wasn't very impressed with the views taken by earlier philosophers and poets. He composed a book of aphorisms in prose, which was later regarded as a treatise on nature and covered a lot of topics: cosmology, human life, and theology. The story goes that he deposited the book in the Temple of Artemis, and that he intentionally composed it in a rather obscure way, so that only people who were competent to interpret these puzzling aphorisms would be able to proceed with it, would be able to make sense of it. Here's a kind of interpretive approach to Heraclitus based on the ideas about medicine we looked at before. That's not to say that Heraclitus was primarily a medical thinker, but it might be a helpful way to make sense of the really wide range of different fragments and testimonies we have in his case. So just like with the Hippocratic doctors, we might start with a diagnosis or recognition of visible signs or symptoms, in this case, not of a physical malady, but of a philosophical one. Human beings seem to take a lot of different views and make mistakes. That's kind of a symptom. Well, what's the cause? Can we diagnose the cause? Heraclitus does have a diagnosis. Everybody's perceptions are private and relative, that is, to their own perspectives, and we're pretty overconfident about our own beliefs. Based on that diagnosis, he offers, we could say, a prognosis and a treatment plan. If we can attend to the pattern in things, the logos that occurs in our speech, our thought, and the world, which he takes to be isomorphic or the same pattern in a way governs how we speak and how we think and how the world works, then we might have a chance to overcome this malady of lack of knowledge, ignorance about the most important things for conducting our lives. The result is an insight into the way reality is really structured. In Heraclitus' view, that insight yields the truth that the opposites are one and that everything is in motion. In Greek, pantare, everything flows. So I'm going to try to talk through Heraclitus' thought in these terms, a kind of diagnosis, prognosis, or treatment plan, and the method that gets us there. So in sequence, we'll talk first about how he diagnoses and looks at the symptoms, the method he recommends, and the result that he achieves. So the first step is the symptoms, just how bounded human insight turns out to be. Here's some of the fragments of Heraclitus that I think illustrate this. On one quote, on Heraclitus' view, human opinions or appearances are the playthings of children. That theme again of children at play in some way being wiser than the apparently wisest of human beings. For Heraclitus, the knowledge of the most famous is just opinion or seeming. And what about most people? On his view, most of us lack insight, nous, or intelligence, trusting popular stories, think of Hesiod or Homer again, taking the mob or the majority of people, obviously in this case in a pejorative sense, as their teacher, unaware that only a few people are good. Probably in this sense have wisdom or understanding of the kind that Heraclitus seeks. Again, one response to that might be if you take enough time to study, to gain mathesis or learning, the root of our word mathematics, maybe you'll be able to learn. But his suggestion is that we know of a lot of people who learned, who gained a lot of mathesis or mathemata, Hesiod, Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Hecataeus, and he thinks they still made mistakes. Again, we can note from this his sensitivity to the multiplicity of opinions in his intellectual environment. Another difficulty is that even people who do hear the truth, he thinks, don't understand it. They're present but metaphorically absent. So why is this? Can we get to the cause of these symptoms of the limits of human understanding? One is, it's just tough. So in another fragment, fragment 123, nature, according to Heraclitus, loves to hide. This kind of mystery is built into the fabric of reality. So that's one. Another possible cause is what we could call the relativism of perspectives or opinions. This might come out in some of the following fragments, like 61 and 9. The sea, let's talk about seawater, could be seen as healthy or unhealthy, depending on who's in it or drinking it. For human beings, salt water, if you have too much of it, can be really destructive. For fish, it's good. So it matters what species you belong to, whether salt water could be rightly called healthy or unhealthy. So too, in a kind of playful sense, he points out that donkeys would rather get into the garbage than find gold. Humans obviously take a different view. And there's a number of fragments like this in Heraclitus that have this sort of general sense that perspectives are relative. This later will be important to ethical and other kinds of epistemological relativism with thinkers like the Sophists in Athens, who would argue that just as the wind might seem cold to me and warm to you, perhaps justice is like that too, just a matter of opinion or perspective. But in our case here, the emphasis might just be on this point that perspectives seem to govern our opinions, and everybody's perspective is different. Another challenge we have, in addition to those ones, that it's just hard to figure out nature, it's a mystery, it loves to hide, and that we're working from very particular or relative perspectives, is that people are overconfident. When we don't understand, we tend to think we understand anyway. Psychological phenomenon we're also more familiar with today. And one more challenge is that even divine truths, perhaps especially divine truths, mostly escape our recognition because we don't believe them when we do hear them. So there's a few kind of diagnoses of causes. Nature loves to hide. We all have particular perspectives on things that seem private and distinct. We tend to be overconfident, and we don't necessarily know how to believe the truth when we hear it. So what's the method Heraclitus could be said to prescribe, a sort of treatment plan for this set of challenges? Basically, to follow the common logos. This can be tricky because it's hard to figure out how to translate logos even in the best of cases, and Heraclitus doesn't make it much easier. But here's a few examples. To set the scene before we get to the word itself, Heraclitus uses the metaphor of sleep and wakefulness often, in a way that connects with his notion of the logos. For the waking, he says, there's one common world, and when asleep, each person turns away to a private one. What's he talking about here in fragment 89? Right, dreams. I can have a dream, you can have a dream, but we're probably in different dream worlds, or at least that's one intuitive interpretation. Well, we shouldn't act as if we were in our own dream worlds. It's pretty clear that he's talking about knowledge here as well as something deeper or perhaps a little bit mysterious, as you can see in fragment 26, about the experience of dreaming. In the night, a person kindles a light for themselves while their sight goes out, that is, they dream. Living, they touch the dead while they sleep, but waking, they touch the sleeper. Again, this is a mysterious passage we could spend a lot of time interpreting, but one sense is that he is talking about dreams. And the very individual or private experience of kindling a light and experiencing a dream. There's also a suggestion here that there's some access to another world in a dream, and some of the other fragments suggest there's something like that to it. But coming back to our theme, dream worlds are private. That is, my dream seems different from your dream. That's a metaphor in this case for what knowledge is like. Most people live like they're in their own dream world, living with their own particular perspectives, Heraclitus thinks. And maybe this also applies to philosophical doctrines in schools, to mythological traditions, and so on. They're not necessarily interested in the common patterns with others. In the example I gave before from different cultural traditions, this might be like the Greek philosopher who recognizes a common pattern, or logos, between the Egyptian and Greek stories of earth and sky, where for the world to evolve in the way it has with nature, it became necessary for a divine intervention to separate the earth and the sky. So even though the stories are otherwise very different, there's a common pattern to look for, or a logos. This is a much broader sense of logos at the same time. This, what Heraclitus is interested in, is a kind of deep pattern, again, in how we speak and think and in how the world is organized, that somehow holds constantly or consistently across the board. But humans don't understand it. In usually what's fragment 1 of Heraclitus, a longer fragment about the logos. And we don't understand it whether we haven't heard it yet or even when we do. We distinguish each thing in accordance with its nature. That is, we don't see maybe how they all hang together, what the patterns are that govern behavior, action, and experience in the world as a whole. And that is because it's like we're living in our own private dream worlds, our own simulated realities. A little bit more about this. Heraclitus, though, as you've seen, he can be quite critical, also has an optimism. Thinking, or thinking straight, sophrene, as fragments 112 and 113 show, is common to everybody. He thinks all human beings have access to the logos, if you like, to thinking truly. And it is possible then to achieve wisdom, or sophia, to speak the truth and act naturally. People who speak with insight, he says, have to rely firmly on what's common to everyone as a city relies on its laws. It belongs to everyone to know themselves, notice the Delphic overtone, and to think soundly. I searched out myself, he says, which suggests that though we are talking about engaging with many different perspectives and finding what's common in them, there's also value especially in introspection, that is, in finding the logos of the psyche. So in this famous fragment number 45, you would not discover the limits of the psyche, though you traveled every road. So deep a logos, or a kind of deep pattern, does it have. He also suggests that what's hidden is stronger than what's apparent, so it's worth doing this work to find the hidden patterns in things. And he sometimes calls this a tuning, or a harmony, in Greek harmonia. And he also refers to Delphi as an exemplar of what he's trying to do. The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi, that is Apollo speaking through the Pythia, neither speaks nor conceals in an explicit way, but gives a sign, semine. You can think back again to the medical work of prognosis from signs, and also this sort of idea that nature loves to hide, but the underlying pattern can be sought out through looking to what's common, through exploring what's in common between all these different perspectives, and especially somehow finding the logos or pattern within, in our own psyche. So what's the outcome? If we have this sort of diagnosis, here's the signs of human ignorance, here's the cause, this sort of combination of the difficulty of understanding nature, the relativism of perspectives, our overconfidence, our unwillingness to believe what's true. Here's a method. Try to attend to the common logos, look for the patterns and find them especially in one's own psyche. What's the result? There's some definite, we might say, metaphysical discoveries of Heraclitus, or conclusions that he reaches based on attending to the common pattern in things. One is that in some sense, all things are one or united. In particular, the opposites are united. There's some famous fragments like one, the way up and the way down is the same, which is an intuitive example. The road that takes you uphill also takes you downhill and uphill again. For Heraclitus, this applies to all the opposites, all the contraries in the world. These binaries we construct, really they resolve into one. Another discovery or metaphysical conclusion for Heraclitus is that one cannot step in the same river twice, in the most famous formulation of the idea. This is because the river is always changing. So the second time I step in it, it is in a way a different river. But I'm also changing too. I'm flowing or in flux. You can think of this in sort of physical terms, in the theory that all the cells in my body change, and over a few years, a lot of the matter that makes me up has changed. The famous ship of Theseus problem, which you can Google about whether a ship that's changed all its planks is still the same ship, and if it happened over hundreds of years, at what point did it change, can apply to human experience as well. So Heraclitus also has this notion that we're all in flux and the world is in flux, but change itself is a constant. In fragment 84a, in change it rests. That sort of constance could be seen as the logos itself. There's a pattern in the change. In fact, you could say there's a pattern in me. Even as my matter is in flux, I myself, the pattern of that matter, is constant. Even as the ship's planks are changed out over hundreds of years, the shape, the pattern, or the governing structure of the ship remains the same. That might be something of the concept of the logos as well. It's interesting as well that for Heraclitus, these combined ideas about each of us and each thing being in a way a pattern in flux, or instantiated in flux, and somehow this flux or tension, meaning that everything is united or one. This means that reality is kind of like tuning a musical instrument. There's a tension between opposites, a tonos, a harmony that is always being held. This idea of constant change with a pattern. He talks about beverages that need to be stirred all the time as an example of this in the results he's finding. He talks about a kind of backstretched connection, or palintropos, turning back again, tuning, or harmony in the music of the world. Not necessarily in a literal way, but metaphorically then, strife or tension is a necessity. We only know one opposite from the other. We only know, he thinks, about justice because we've experienced injustice. And unless we know that, according to Heraclitus, unless we recognize that, we don't necessarily see how, to quote from fragment 51, though at variance with itself, this logos in the world agrees with itself. It swings like a pendulum back and forth, but it's all held in tension, just like the string of a lyre or of a bow. This recognition, this sort of united wisdom in the world, can be called by a mythic name like Zeus, but also can be seen as a logos, as an underlying reality beneath all the mythoi or traditions. It can also be called fire, and Heraclitus speaks sometimes of the logos like light or fire, an idea that the later Stoics will pick up as well. Again, he emphasizes that this means the opposites are really one, the road up and down are the same, living and dead are one, waking and sleeping are one, young and old are one, in the sense that there's a constant flux back and forth, if you like. These transformed are those transformed are these, back and forth. God is day and night, he says, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and hunger, but changes just as fire mingled with perfumes is named according to the scent of each. So this helps us to understand the fire metaphor a little. Fire in itself may not have a smell or a scent, but whatever is added, whatever perfume is added, there is a scent. Without the fire, we don't necessarily have that scent. So in the same way, he says that all things are in exchange for fire, this underlying singular unity that is the tension, the logos, like the tuning of a lyre, perhaps many lyre strings, all of us, everything in the world is tuned in this remarkable way. So there's a few ethical conclusions that also follow from these metaphysical discoveries. There's no need to sort of go into acts of violence, go overboard trying to, exceed the pendulum swing, to hold one opposite rather than another. Hubris, that is this sort of overweening, arrogant violence, must be quenched, more than a fire. There's a sense in Heraclitus of human freedom, that our daimon, that is the kind of divine agent governing our lives, is actually our own character. We can tune our own lyre strings, if you like. Another conclusion is, because of this recognition that things are in tension, that we can't just have one of the opposites, they come together, it's not necessarily better for us to get everything we want. If you think of the Pythagorean tuning of the lyre again as a metaphor that Heraclitus is working with too, if it's too loose, if it's too easy, if there's no challenges, it's hard to be living what feels like a meaningful human life. On the other hand, if it's too tight, the string could break. If it's too overwhelming, too challenging, too hard to find meaning in things. So for Heraclitus, this tension, this tonos or harmony is somewhere in the middle, recognizing the swing of the pendulum, if you like, both ways, neither too tight nor too loose, and there we live this meaningful human life. Again, the idea that each of the opposites then helps to make the others possible and meaningful. He also has some ideas about traditional religion, which are also hard to interpret and aphoristic, but the suggestion, for example, that some of the gods are one and the same, in a deeper sense, for example, Hades and Dionysus, and in some way that divine inspiration or madness can possibly justify or make reasonable actions that go to extremes in one direction or another, like the Bacchic celebrations in honor of Dionysus. It's not clear whether Heraclitus is endorsing this. In some contexts, he seems to criticize popular religion. In some cases, he seems to be suggesting that there's a deeper truth in it if we know how to look. But it's clear that some of the aphorisms that are in the book alongside these metaphysical and ethical ideas do touch on the meaning of divine inspiration and religious inspiration. So to sum up, a therapeutic approach to Heraclitus, he's looking for the signs of, let's say in this case, a philosophical or psychological malady, the errors and differences of opinions and arguments that we all get into. And he diagnoses a cause, which is the relativism of perceptions and human overconfidence. He suggests a prognosis or a treatment to attend to the shared logos or pattern in how we speak and think and in the world, which we can find by searching out ourselves, the logos in the psyche. And he also suggests that in the results we find, we'll recognize that things we think are opposite are actually a unity and tension, like a lyre string that is tuned, not too tight, not too loose. We're like that too. And another way of looking at that is that we're like a flowing river in a way. That string, that tuning is not maybe a concrete thing, but a relationship in flow. Here's a few more takeaways. So if we think of Heraclitus in a nutshell, we can recognize his insight that our views, our doxai, our opinions are relative to our sensory perceptions and our perceptions and perspective in general, nonetheless that a pattern or logos holds across all those relative perceptions. There's an optimism there, that change is a constant. In the slogan connected with his student Cratylus, Panta Re, everything flows like a river, and yet the opposites are unified. Finally, that tension, tonos or harmonia, is part and parcel of human life, neither too tight nor too loose. So those are some of our general topics about Heraclitus and the themes of relativism, the constancy of change, and the logos. And again, we'll find that it's interesting to consider Heraclitus, especially in light of some of the other contemporary philosophers or near contemporaries like Parmenides and Empedocles, who take related views.
Meden